Welcome to the 8th Annual Accessibility Awareness Days event. I'm Sherry Gagno, Accessibility Manager in the Office of Human Rights, Equity and Accessibility, and the moderator for the event this year. If you've been following along, you'll know that today is the fourth of 5 short workshops, so we're nearing the end of this month-long event. We've appreciated all our speakers as we have been having great conversations keeping with the theme, it's accessible, but is it inclusive? If this is your first time attending, I'll give a brief recap on how the event runs. Presenters will share a 20-minute presentation, leaving time for a short question and answer period. Please type your questions in the chat box during the presentation and we will address them at the end. If you require closed captioning, look for the 3 dots in the menu bar and scroll to the bottom of the drop-down menu and select Turn on Live Captions. Before I get into introductions, we have been drawing 2 names each week from the list of attendees for a $25 Indigo gift card. Winners are announced the following week. So without further ado, I'm happy to announce the 2 winners who attended last week's event, and they are Hannah Leese, graduate student in Human Kinetics, and Zaytan, Public Affairs and Communications. Congratulations, you will be receiving an email shortly. This week's topic is accessible online education during the pandemic and beyond. This week's presenter is Nick Baker, who is the director of the Office of Open Learning. He has been teaching and researching online learning and education technology for 2 decades and is a strong advocate for accessible education for all learners. He is the chair of Ontario University's Council on E-Learning and a director on the board of eCampus Ontario. Nick is an award-winning educator and a leader in Canada and Australia, recently receiving an award for excellence from the Ontario Minister of Colleges and Universities for his work in helping universities transition to online learning. I'm so pleased to turn the presentation over to Nick. Enjoy.
Thank you very much, Sherry. Hoping everyone can hear me loud and clear. Just looking for a check from my colleagues. Yep, good to go. All right, thank you so much for joining us. And I know we don't have a whole lot of time. This is a huge topic to deal with, so I'm hoping to introduce you to just some kind of key concepts and some places to go to look for more information. So we're going to try and get through some of these topics today, thinking through what accessible education is. We'll delve into universal design for learning for a little bit. We'll talk about some accessible assessment options and a model for doing that. Ways in which you can make decisions about the technology that you include in your courses, for example, and it wouldn't be a presentation from me without talking about open educational practices and pedagogies. And at the end, I will share with you some checklists that you might want to use for determining accessibility of your courses. So there's a lot of learning that's happened during the pandemic, both in our students, but also in the ways in which we interact with each other. Things are just very different. And we've learned very quickly that many of the things that we've taken for granted in the past really don't exist for many, many people. A couple of quick facts. In Canada, approximately 22% of Canadians, or 6.2 million people over the age of 15, identify as having at least one disability. 60% of youth with disabilities have a mental health related disability. 1 in 10 Canadians has a learning disability. About 50% of students with a disability require at least one learning aid or assistive device or accommodation to be successful in their courses. Most of those disabilities are invisible. We know that adults with disabilities are only about half as likely to graduate from university as other adults, and that women are much more likely in that group to drop out of formal education due to their disabilities. Students with disabilities take a lot longer to pay off their debts, so they're saddled with many things from their education for far longer than the rest of us. We also know that about 3 million Canadians have a disability that makes it difficult or impossible for them to read conventional print. These people are our students. These are students who are in your class every day, and whether you know that they have disabilities or not, many of your students will be invisible to you as a result of that. So I want to think about, whenever we start talking about accessibility in our courses, I want you to think about who has access to the learning in your classes. Traditionally, universities have been set up in such a way that they're elite and they exclude a lot of people. So think about what are the barriers to entry for your students, who is excluded from your courses, and in the context of the pandemic, who now has access who didn't before, who will require alternatives to some of the things that you may have done in the past. So COVID-19 comes along, and as Nancy Doyle says, we've all now been disabled. In the current environment, we've noticed that there are a lot of accommodations for disabilities that are appearing as a result, but it's not because of some wonderful ethical awakening of people in our industry or of government. It's because everyone has been disabled by this activity, by this pandemic. So all of us are working in a situation that's no longer ideal. And that is the way in which people with disabilities in our classrooms have been dealing forever. A couple of quotes from students about how disabilities are impacting them during COVID. For some people, there are some really positive outcomes as a result of this, because we have seen shifts in the way that we do things now. Right, so Tom Staniford, for example, describes this as leveling the playing field. He's a student in Pennsylvania. Rather than opening up new opportunities, he says he finds it infuriating to see people moaning about reduced mobility and challenges of remote working and fear of illness and long periods of isolation, because all of those are things that he's experienced on a daily basis. Carly Fox is a first-year student at University of Ottawa. She says, as someone who's physically disabled, physically attending classes used to be my main barrier. Now, with everything online, the fear of falling behind due to my physical absence is gone. I don't have to worry about my disability inhibiting my education. Emma Duke is a student of fourth year at UCLA, and she had been trying and advocating for her entire degree program to get some of her film courses online, and she was told that there was no way that it was unfeasible. And she's torn now because all of her learning is online, and she says she's torn between being grateful that she can get her education and feeling betrayed that it was actually possible the whole time. So let's look back on where accessible education, the concept, comes from. You'll often hear online learning described as distance learning, and what was traditionally distance education is now online. This has actually been around for a very long time for the purpose of providing access to students who couldn't attend regular schools. So the first open distance course, for example, was actually run in 1728 out of Boston. And it was a course that was designed to help women who were not allowed to have access to most educational settings at the time. And there are lots of examples of that through history. In the current context, students who would choose normally to be online learners often are often quite diverse and have really diverse needs. Now, at the moment, with all of us learning online, students who have those diverse needs, who have not had to deal with the concept of an online learning platform before, may struggle with that. And of course, this idea of the digital divide, where there are resources that some people have access to that others do not, creates significant barriers to many groups of learners. We know that it is really expensive to have a disability for many people. And so they may not have access to the same kinds of technology. They may not be able to afford it that other learners may have. And of course, just meeting the technical accessibility standards that are required of us does not make the course accessible or inclusive. So this idea of accessible higher education, a few years ago, Council of Ontario Universities put together a package to try and assist faculty to understand what accessible higher education would look like. And really what they're talking about is designing your curriculum so that it is accessible to everyone. You use different instructional methods to meet the needs of the greatest number of learners. But as I said before, traditional universities often take an elitist approach and have struggled to provide accessible and inclusive learning environments, and there's lots and lots of evidence of that. Often we try and approach this by just changing the size of the door. And so when when government's trying to address this through policy, often what they do is try and expand access to people to get them through that door. So they make the door wider, but making the door wider doesn't help students once they get through the door. On the other side of that door are all of the struggles that they had on the outside, except now they're amplified by the pressure of being in a higher education setting. So what we need to do when we get through that door is provide all of the supports that students need to be able to be successful. And accessible education principles are a way to approach that. So essentially what we're trying to do is to take account of all of the variability that exists in our student population and support students in a way that makes sense to them. From a university's perspective, it's important that that addresses academic rigor. We know that we have lots of conversations about that, but there are certainly ways to do that without compromising anything that we hold dear in universities. What we're trying to do is remove as many barriers as possible for the largest body of students. And one of the things that does is by removing barriers systemically, by designing in a way that we don't place barriers in front of people, it means that we don't have to put a lot of effort and work into specializing accommodations for individual students. And really what we're talking about here is just good pedagogy, good ways of teaching. It doesn't have to be a huge amount of work on your part. So universities are kind of moving along this spectrum, and it is a spectrum from providing equal access to providing accessible education. One of the places where we kind of often get stuck is this idea of accommodation versus accessibility. So in the accommodation model, we take the approach that a student with a disability has a problem that's a problem for that individual, and that problem should be addressed by that person in relation to some kind of disability service program. In the accessible education approach, how we would approach that is we would design the learning environment, and the person who's responsible for designing the learning environment, the instructor and probably an instructional designer from my team, for example, would help you design that space so that it's available to people in the way that they need it. So it's really a shift between placing individual responsibility on the person with a disability to designing activities and spaces that are inclusive, that are accessible to everyone, that are available to everyone as part of our curriculum design. And really, there's a lot less work in doing that than there is trying to accommodate for so many different individual needs on an individual basis. And if you're a student with a disability and you have to do this, you have to approach 5 instructors every term, plus SAS, and ask for an accommodation, even if it's the same accommodation over and over again. This is not contributing to inclusivity of our environment. So kind of extending that idea into universal design for learning, the UDL principles come from a concept in architecture in the 70s, where an architect may design a building from scratch that has accessibility features built into it, so they don't have to retrofit it expensively down the track. So instead of putting only stairs into a building, you might design a building that already has a ramp. And that ramp is actually useful not just for people in wheelchairs or people with mobility issues, it's also really useful for people getting carts in and out, moving heavy objects, being able to rapidly access the building. And it's the same with things like sidewalks. We design those so that people can move around when it's wet, when it's muddy, when it's cold, when it's icy. And those don't just make it easier for people with disabilities, they make it easier for everyone. So the concept of universal design for learning builds on that and has 3 core principles: providing multiple means of learner engagement, providing multiple means of representing information, providing multiple means of for learners to take action and express themselves. So we're designing an environment where people are able to individualize their approach. And I'm not going to go through these. I'm going to make these slides available to you so you have all of the links and the resources. But the Center for Applied Special Technology, or CAST, is probably the kind of the leading space where the idea of universal design for learning began. They've built out a whole series of resources. And essentially what they're talking about here is, under your three kind of conceptual areas: engagement, representation, and action, you build over time capacity in students to become functioning experts in your discipline area. So for example, under the representation area, you might have multiple ways to represent the same information. You might provide a written version, a visual version, a video explanation, and plan for low bandwidth approaches as well. In the ability to express yourself, a student might have opportunities to practice exams in the format in which you're going to give them in the end if you use exams. Or you might allow students agency in choosing the approach and topics that actually make sense to them in their own context. Those things also contribute to engagement, by the way, because students who enjoy the work that they're doing are much more likely to be engaged and much less likely to engage in activities that you may wish them not to, such as cheating, quote unquote. You also want to, in thinking through engagement, you want to think about how you can engage students in multiple ways. So providing lots of different opportunities for points of contact, not just all synchronous or asynchronous, sometimes text-based, sometimes video-based, providing different spaces for people to work in. And also really don't ignore your time zones. I'm often asked about how you create accessible education, accessible assessment platforms. So this is a model that's kind of developed from some work at McMaster University. It's adapted for here. The flavor model looks at lots of different ways, common sense ways, in fact, to design your assessment that require less accessibility accommodations. So flavor stands for flexibility, so students have some agency and choice in their assessment, and the flexibility to equitably adjust to the individual needs of students. That is something that you can do as an instructor. They're learning focus, so the assessment facilitates and supports learning, not just evaluation of learning. They're aligned to the learning outcomes and the learning activities. They're intentionally linked together so students can see how those work together. There's variety, multiple opportunities to express and demonstrate knowledge, and multiple methods and environments are available to students. The assessment is valid, so it evaluates what it's intended to and is not influenced by arbitrary, hidden, or unrelated criteria or learning outcomes. So the questions you're asking yourself there are you actually measuring what you think you are? Quite often when we design assessment, we are really not measuring the thing that we think we are. We also often don't cover the content that we intend to in our assessment practices. Is it explicit? Are there instructions, expectations, and the conventions of academia for your discipline clearly communicated? Do you have exemplars and detailed rubrics that students can use to help them learn? And then is it reliable? So are the assessments able to be calibrated and reliably evaluate the learning you think you are over time? Almost at the end here now, a couple of minutes left, but thinking about how do you make decisions about technology? So a series of questions to ask yourself, and if you don't know the answers to these questions, my staff and IT are often the best place to go to ask these questions. But first of all, many people are being approached by lots of different companies right now. Vendors have got these magic solutions that they've got that they can sell you for just a small amount to your students. You can get this kind of magical thing that will do all of the work for you of teaching. The reality is that none of that actually exists. They will spin you lots and lots of stories, and most of them are untrue. And what you'll find is if you try to engage in using many of these tools, you really need to work with people who know how to evaluate whether these things are accessible or not. So we have a responsibility under the AAD to ensure that anything that we take on institutionally meets the requirements for accessibility. And I will tell you that the vast majority of technologies, and especially immature technologies, newer ones that have appeared since the pandemic, do not meet those requirements. So does it enhance learning for all learners, not just a very particular group? And really, you have to consider that many of these technologies may harm or discriminate against some learners. That happens a lot in the design of things. Often these are designed by people who are not UX or universal design specialists. And there are a few things that we can ask them technically that will get us to a point where we understand. Lauren Anstey and Gavin Watson, both formerly from Western University, both kind of moved on now. They came up with this rubric for e-learning tool evaluation, which I've got in the resources at the end. That's a really good tool to help you think through, do I actually need technology in this thing that I'm trying to achieve? And of course, accessibility and inclusivity are not the same thing. The Association of College and University Educators has an inclusive teaching practices toolkit. Each one of those 10 items has a series of resources attached to it. So if you're interested in the difference between inclusivity and kind of technical accessibility, this is a really good place to start. And I think probably number one on the list is one of the most important things you can possibly consider. Does your course reflect the diverse society and world around us? All of the other things we can deal with kind of a technical way, but from an inclusivity point of view, representing your discipline in the diversity within which it sits is critical. One other framework that I would point to out of Plymouth, this is some work of Robin DeRosa and Martha Burtis. They have this ACE tool, and it thinks about curriculum at the kind of the activity level or assignment level, course level, and institutional level. And they have a series of resources for each of these. I would suggest focusing on the equity component for what we're talking about today. There are some fantastic resources there, but it kind of builds on this idea of universal design, where we design our curriculum to be accessible to everyone. And of course, finally, as I mentioned, open pedagogies. This is where my office sits. David Wiley came up with this idea of open pedagogies and OER enabled pedagogies. And you'll see lots of crossover between this and universal design ideas. So they're student-centered, they're learning-focused, they're about empowering and engaging students, they're about engaging students as partners and collaborators and producers of knowledge, not just passive consumers in our classrooms. And they're often associated with digital literacy. Robin DeRosa says that open pedagogy is a way of thinking about teaching and learning that foregrounds access, commons-oriented approaches to sharing knowledge, and connections inside and between communities. And our good friend Rajiv Janjani from Kwantlen says that if we merge open educational resource advocacy with pedagogical approaches that focus on collaboration and connection, diversity and democracy, and critical assessment of educational tools and structures, we can begin to understand the breadth and power of open pedagogy as a guiding praxis. I'll leave you with this idea. As we move towards moving back onto campus, we need to engage in a discussion of what it means to be educators. We have all learned many, many things in the last year. We have also learned that there are a lot of tools that are out there that bake in pedagogies that we may not necessarily want to have anything to do with. And we need to consider what value the relationship that we bring to students being on campus and off campus is, and why we choose to gather, whether virtually or physically, in spaces such as universities. So it's really critical that we do not lose the gains that we've made over the last year. It may feel like we're constantly banging against a wall, but in reality, with us all becoming disabled to some extent, what we've done is made the world a much more accessible place for people who have struggled for such a long time. So I'll leave you with that thought, and we can share these slides and you can have all of the resources. And if you have any questions, Oh, I did say I would give you an accessibility checklist as well. There are lots of them out there. Most of them are built on the work of a couple of different areas. These are some of the shorter ones that I think are actually probably useful from a faculty perspective. They're not designed for instructional designers. They're all easy to work with. All right, I will leave it there. Sorry, I'm a little bit over time, Sherry.
That's okay. That's okay. It was great. Thank you so much. It was a very timely topic in the light of everything we've been facing as an institution over the past year and the impact that it's had on education. So we do actually have a few questions. I'll give another minute or two for a couple more to come in. But while we wait, I just will remind all participants that the sessions are being recorded and links to the recording will be shared once the event is over, and we'll send that out by email to all the registrants. So first question, thank you, brilliant. In current teaching, remote teaching times, would you recommend relying more heavily on synchronous, asynchronous, or a mix of both for accessible teaching and learning?
I would have to say I would strongly recommend a mix of both, with student choice in the ability to engage in the way that makes most sense for them. So you will find that some students really need time to process things, and the asynchronous approach helps them with that. But maintaining connection and a human connection to your students through optional synchronous times is really important as well.
Another question that has came in beforehand is, and you touched a little bit on this in your presentation, while we've heard many challenges that online learning has presented to students and faculty, what do you think are some of the greatest advantages that it has had for students with accessibility needs?
I think we've certainly seen, our students have told us loud and clearly that the access to pre-recorded materials or to recordings of live sessions where they can go back and review at their own pace, where they can, particularly for our international learners as well, who have English as an additional language, can go back to the transcript, to the captions, and really understand what was happening in that section. We have some new tools coming that will allow students to kind of search through those and build a series of notes around that. I think the flexibility of not having to physically come to a campus and navigate your way around a campus, particularly in winter, has made a big difference to a lot of students. Certainly from a mental health point of view, as much as people have been locked away, and the majority of people think in terms of wanting to be back on campus and wanting to see other people. There are many people who we have in our community who, for them, that is not something that they want to experience. That it elicits anxiety, it elicits, responses that are not optimal for learning. And so being able to learn when they are able to is important.
Okay, a related question is around described video. Students do appreciate visuals, but simply speaking to an image with no descriptions leave people who can't see well at a disadvantage.
Yes. Yeah, I would agree. And I think I've certainly seen in some awareness of that building even in our everyday meetings. You see times where people, because they're online, tend to describe what's on screen in a little better way than they may have in a physical classroom, where they might have pointed to it in a classroom or said, you can see from this in a classroom. They tend to be a little bit more explicit. We certainly have a lot more way to go there. And there are certainly settings where described video is actually probably more important. We have the ability to deal with that if we need to. But I agree. I think we still have, it's a change in mindset that you have to go through to think through, whenever I'm presenting something, what does this image mean? Why is this image here, for example? That's another thing that people often put images in that are unrelated to the content. They're just here's a pretty cat picture. It's a nice cat picture, but it doesn't actually relate to it. So when a person with low vision encounters that, they would have no idea why that's there. And they will use up some of their cognitive ability in trying to figure out what this thing means and could lose their place.
Well, it's 12 o'clock, so we've reached the end of our time limit, but we've had some great questions. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Nick, for your time this morning. Thanks, everyone who's joined and participated in these conversations around accessibility. We encourage you to join us again next week. Next week, we will be having our keynote speaker, Dave Dame. He's a person with lived experience, and he will be talking, his topic is Inclusion Has to Be Purposeful. Next week, we also have tacked on an extra 10 minutes for our closing ceremonies from 12 to 12:10. So you're welcome just to stay on the call and join us for the conclusion of this event. So thanks, everyone. Hopefully we'll see you next week at 11:30.